Hi, I'm Courtney Sobers, an assistant teaching professor at Rutgers Newark. I primarily teach general chemistry lab and organic chemistry lecture. Today, this recording is a conversation between one of the teaching assistants, Ryan Houser, and myself about ungrading the General Chemistry 2 lab, which was held remotely with over 300 students doing at-home lab experiments. Ryan has a unique perspective as not only was he a teaching assistant, he was also a head teaching assistant. So he talked with a lot of the other teaching assistants during the course and helped guide them in how to teach in so many ways, as inclusive as that word is. So I hope you enjoy the conversation and we look forward to answering any questions you may have during the Q&A session. Thanks.
I'm Ryan. I'm one of the TAs for General Chemistry Lab. I've TA'd Chem 1 and Chem 2 labs for about 4 semesters now. I'm also TAing Organic Chemistry this summer. I have a master's in biohazardous threat agents and emerging infectious diseases from Georgetown. I went to undergrad at Rutgers and did my post-bac in Rutgers Newark, which is where I took Gen Chem lab with Dr. Sobers as a student, and then started as a TA after I finished Gen Chem 2 lab. So I've had experience on both sides of the lab as a student and as a TA.
And we are going to talk about how we did ungrading in a General Chemistry 2 lab class with over 300 students. But first, we need to explain what did ungrading mean in this context.
So ungrading is an evaluation method that we used in the lab, which allows us as TAs to provide students with feedback instead of points. So nothing ended up having grades. Everything was just provided in terms of comments on whether the student was on the right track, whether they got the question right or wrong, and to provide them some feedback that they could use on subsequent assignments to kind of foster their learning and their education process. This also included some soft due dates that allowed some flexibility, which was extremely helpful during the pandemic and a virtual and remote learning environment.
Yeah, so, and part of the reason why I found this as an instructor such an appealing pedagogical approach was that our student population includes students who are formerly incarcerated, students who are first generation, who work full-time, but are also students full-time. And so in the classroom, we have some students who've never taken a chemistry class before, ever, and some who've taken AP chemistry. So how do we design a classroom that is beneficial to everybody? Everybody has a chance to learn, but also doesn't stress them out as much. So as an educator who wants to make the classroom a welcoming space, chemistry and lab specifically is a really challenging place to do that. Not just because it's chemistry and people tend to hear chemistry and then panic, but also when you're in the lab space, it feels like everybody's watching you and you can't hide. So ungrading is meant to emphasize that we're not judging you when we're watching you. We're here to help you learn. And learning can be, yes, you get it right on the first time, which is great, but it can also be improving over time. And this is important because in our classroom, we have some students who have never taken chemistry at all before, and some who've taken AP chemistry. Now, as the instructor, I get to design the course, and so I can use ungrading in this way to set up the classroom. But the actual teaching is done by TAs like you, Ryan. And so how did you meld your teaching to ungrading?
I think I definitely have a structured teaching style, which was the concern going into ungrading, which seemed on the onset to be a bit chaotic, not really having a lot of structure, which I wasn't sure if that would actually provide me the opportunity to be a good TA, because I was trying to navigate an environment that I wasn't comfortable with. But I actually found it to be a good complement, where I was still able to use my teaching style, but rather it was more of a focus on how I was providing an evaluation to the students. So instead of worrying about right or wrong answers, as you mentioned, I was able to provide students with feedback on their questions and their answers. So even if they were getting the question right, there was still a dialogue that we were having. So students were still interacting with the material, even if they were getting the question right on the first try. Which I think was a great benefit to them to kind of continue their learning process. And then for students who were on the right track but not there yet, we again were able to have that dialogue, which allowed them to kind of learn along the way. So even having probably a more structured approach to teaching, I was still able to successfully implement the ungrading process. And I think it actually went very well and was able to be flexible enough that other TAs with different teaching styles and different approaches were also able to successfully adapt ungrading and the techniques to their particular teaching style.
Did you find that class time was less stressful because you still were able to have a structure, but there was less of that, like, this has to be answered before you leave today?
Yeah, certainly. In lab a lot with our previous method of grading, we used an online platform which automatically graded answers. So a lot of the time was spent on, can you teach me how to do this particular problem? What's the math and the process for this problem? But in class, it was a bit more laid back because students were aware that they weren't going to get graded on a particular problem, right or wrong, but it was more of a process. So how could they learn the chemistry and the methods for doing that? So I was able to kind of work through the problems, work through the concepts, and students were able to take the time to actually comprehend and apply what they were learning rather than focusing on, let me make sure I know exactly how to do this problem before I leave lab today, because I need to make sure I get the question right so I can get a good grade.
Ungrading is just kind of one of the many approaches I use in the classroom. And I try to incorporate everybody who's involved in the class in being the best they can be, either as a student or a learner, because everybody's learning, even if you are teaching. And so prior to converting the course to ungrading, I had been workshopping this inclusivity training, which you've done a couple times now, primarily to address physical disabilities in the lab room. It did touch on other aspects of identity, but most of it was towards the physical disabilities. Once we moved online, I found the training to be even more important and gave me more opportunities to talk about those elements of identity. Lab makes it really hard to hide. So if there's something that you are worried about or concerned about, you feel like everybody can see you because everybody can see you because you have to do it. It has to get done. You have to pipette, you have to titrate, you have to do this thing. Then we shifted online and we did do remote labs. We did do hands-on labs for this class, but you also found that the inequities between the students became a lot more obvious. And from your perspective, did you feel that ungrading complemented the existing training in a way that felt genuine to what you value as a TA and what you would value if you would have been a student in the class?
I thought the inclusivity training when we first started in person was a great experience. As TAs, we have a role in students' education, allowing TAs to understand how they interact with students and how those interactions can have profound impacts on students' education, not only in the class, but moving forward and how they feel they fit in the science space, whatever that may be. So when we shifted to online and virtual lab, there were a lot more situations where TAs were exposed to students who were having a lot of difficulties with their personal lives. Being virtual meant they were at home, having to deal with different family situations. So having that training was great for us as TAs to be able to ensure that we were being inclusive of all our students. I think there was a nice complement between ungrading and the inclusivity training, which allowed for an actual better inclusive environment to kind of consider not only the training that we had in terms of considering the different populations and the different needs of our students, but then to also allow them the opportunity to have that be built into the course and their evaluation method.
Ungrading was new for most of the students in the class, and it wasn't around until about halfway or when they first did that first grade proposal that students felt like they understood what ungrading was and that I wasn't trying to trick them. I noticed that the students seemed to be a lot more engaged in the course when they were online. There was a couple students at spring break where they hadn't done any work. And then when I talked to them, they were like, hey, I was like, hey, you can still get an A. I just need you to show me that you're learning. And then they were like, wait, I can still pass this class? And it was like, yeah. And I got a good number of students back in the course just off of that alone. And so I really loved ungrading for that. But usually I don't hear from students until the end of the course when they're like, what's my grade going to be? And so as a TA, can you talk a little bit about what was it like throughout the entire course and how students either interacted with you and kind of the overall student vibe?
Yeah, I think once we got past the initial period of students not understanding what was actually going on and trying to eliminate what was essentially hardwired as a focus on points, with our system still giving points, they were concerned all the way up to their midterm that their points were an indication of how they were doing in the lab or in the course. So once we got past that, it really felt as if we had a better relationship as TA and students. Students started to see us as peers there to help assist them in learning the material, rather than someone that was there to provide an evaluation or a grade for the student. So there was a much bigger focus on learning the material, having conversations about where the concepts were coming from, the applications of the concepts. I had students reaching out to kind of discuss the material outside of what was necessary in the course. So it built up a relationship in where I was actually, or I felt like I was able to actually assist in fostering their education, rather than just being there to essentially grade them and provide them with some sort of evaluation on what they were doing. So it was more built on a back and forth, a dialogue, which I think was nice for students as well. So they were more involved in their grade and their education than they would be if they were just getting points and a grade at the end of the course. So whether they were getting the questions right from the start, they were still getting feedback that said, good job, keep it up, which is nice, and even continue the dialogue there. And then for students that were not getting the questions perfectly right, there was that dialogue to help them understand what they were doing wrong, and allowed students, no matter where they were with their understanding material, to really continue to engage in the concepts, which was helpful to them actually understanding material and not just repeating what they saw in pre-lab or another portion of the course. So I felt as if it benefited me because students were more open to having conversations about the material, even some who wanted to ask questions that were beyond what we were learning, but to expand their knowledge, which I thought was fantastic. So it really allowed me to be more than just a TA in terms of grading or evaluation, and really to have a better relationship with the students.
Yeah, and as we are using ungrading right now during our summer orgo class, I also find that students are a lot more willing to say they don't know. They're willing to be that voice in the room of 120 saying, please, I don't get it. I don't know how to answer this question, which is a really awesome development from the instructor standpoint that I get to see. But yeah, since I think that TA-student relationship is really important, it's always great to hear that ungrading makes it easier in that sense, that I always have to tell teaching assistants that you can be friendly, but you can't be friends. And it's hard to keep that boundary when they know you have to grade them. And so I think removing the grade also takes some of that tension out as well. So, well, thank you so much for your time, Ryan. It's been awesome talking to you about this. And I hope everybody else found it informative, and we look forward to answering questions.
Thank you.